coming. I was encouraged to use my outside voice. I hope that you all can hear me and I hope the recording can hear me. We're so excited to have you here, and we are also so excited to be able to participate in a program that comes out of the Tucson Festival of Books that connects authors with schools. And in particular, we got connected with author, poet, translator, and teacher David Bowles. David has written multiple award-winning titles, most notably The Smoky Meaner, They Call Me Guero, the 13th Street Chapter Books, or 13th Street Chapter Book series, the young adult graphic novel series, The Clockwork Quandera, and the picture book, My Two Border Towns. So David grew up in South Texas in the Rio Grande Valley, which, like Tucson, is a borderland community. His childhood was filled with stories that he heard from his grandmother, Maria Garza, who encouraged him to read. And then books set him on this path that no one else in his family had taken, a path to college and a path to becoming an author and a teacher. And so we're very, very excited to welcome David to join us today. From Texas.
Awesome, thank you. Well, so I'm going to try not to get distracted by the view of the mountains in the background. It's really funny because I tell people that I'm from the Rio Grande Valley, and they're like, the one in New Mexico? I'm like, no. The one in deep South Texas, and people are like, but that's not a valley. And I'm like, I know it's not a valley. You could see that recently on Netflix there was a miniseries about the singer Selena, right? And they had a scene where it was like the McAllen-Reynosa crossing, and I've spent almost my entire life going back and forth across the border there, and that had mountains in the background. They had literally just filmed it in El Paso and CGI'd in McAllen onto the little sign. I'm like, wow, no, that's not where I'm from. And so if you imagine that you've undoubtedly seen the shape of Texas, it is annoyingly prominent everywhere. And if you think of how it tapers to a little tail at the very bottom, that's where I'm from, this little 4-county area that is a floodplain, and for the longest time was just like a ranching community. But when people from the U.S. started coming into the area, from the rest of the U.S. started coming into the area in the early 1900s and starting towns there and bringing grapefruit and orange agriculture into the area, they dubbed it the Magic Valley in order to be able to get more settlers to come in and take over this Mexican-American ranching community. So that is why it's called the Rio Grande Valley and not like just the Delta or floodplain or whatever. Now that I've started talking about it, I think it's really interesting for you to get a feel for how my family came to be there. In about 1749, a man named whose last name was Escandon, governor of the state of Saltillo, of Coahuila, took a bunch of people out of Saltillo, about 25 mestizo families, like Mexican families, and about 12 Tlaxcalteca indigenous families, and came all the way up to the river and settled in different towns. They founded Laredo and Reynosa and Camargo and Mier, most of them on the south side of the bank, but over time the community spread to the north side of the bank as well. And I think that a lot of communities along the border have been that way, but it was a little more deliberate when you think about a river flowing through the middle of that community, right? As the need for more land came and people found ways to ford the river and establish communities on the other side, or to expand their families to the other side. And the northern side of the river was usually apportioned by the King of Spain in these massive land grants. So if you were moving to the north side of the river, to the north bank, you were moving into usually a ranch, a very large ranch held by some rich Spanish landholder. And that's where my dad's side of the family came from. They moved into that area, and we've been living there ever since, now 270 something years. It's a very long time, which is why I'm always amused when people are like, oh, Mexicans on the border. I'm like, this is not something new. I don't know why you guys are acting like we just suddenly just appeared out of nowhere. Our pristine border is being invaded by Mexico. No, Mexicans have been living here for a long time, guy. It's really amusing to me, the kind of ignorance that exists about the history of the U.S. Southwest and how it was obviously once a part of Mexico. But before that, before it was a part of Mexico, obviously it was home to indigenous peoples. And where I'm from, there were a lot of Coahuitecan bands. That's what we call them collectively. But specifically where I'm from, it's to this day we have the homelands of the Istok Gana people, who are perhaps more widely known by their Spanish name, the Carrizo or Comecrudo nation of South Texas. And they're still, trying to fight the good fight and trying to protect their ancestral lands and keep the border wall from being built over the graves of their ancestors and stuff like that. It is tough work, and they're really great people. But a lot of the other bands were kind of absorbed into the Mexican-American population that moved into that area. And so, this is the kind of place that my family established itself in. And after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that ended the U.S.-Mexican War, I don't like to call it the Mexican-American War because I'm Mexican-American, and it sounds weird to call it the Mexican-American War. A war, like a civil war between Mexican-Americans? Well, I don't know, such a thing could happen, I suppose, but it's the U.S.-Mexican War as far as I'm concerned. And with that treaty, the border between the U.S. and Mexico shifted, right, down to the Rio Grande. So you can imagine, like one day, maybe your family lives on the North Bank and your cousins live on the South Bank, but you're all part of the same community. And then suddenly, you are a U.S. citizen and your cousins are Mexican citizens. This is a bizarre thing that happened in the mid-1800s. There's that famous saying, we didn't cross the border crossed us, but like it literally sliced our community in half. Just like it sliced a lot of communities in half, including indigenous communities like the O'odham here in southern Arizona, right? It's just a really terrible thing that happened to a lot of us. But it also, it informs our identity to some extent. And so, fast forward about 100 years to the Great Depression. The Dust Bowl has devastated Oklahoma, and that's when the other side of my family, my mom's family, comes into deep South Texas. Just a lot of those families went west to California, but some of them came south to our now really, really massive grapefruit and orange orchards, and they worked picking fruit, which kind of amuses me to no end to imagine my great-grandparents on my mom's side picking oranges and grapefruit, because you won't find white people doing that work anymore, will you? It's just like not something that happens very often. If you remember a few years ago, like during the pandemic, there was like this real shortage of labor in agriculture, and fruit was just like rotting on the branches of these trees. And I didn't see a whole lot of people like knocking down the doors of these like large agricultural warehouses saying, please let us go pick fruit, we don't have work. And yet people don't want undocumented people in this country. It's a really, I'm gonna be saying a lot of political things, just a heads up, I'm sorry, it's just me, I can't help it. I'll try not to beat you too hard over the head with my beliefs, but they are informed by my identity, so it's kind of hard to avoid them. But they came in and they were welcomed into the community. This is something about South Texas that I think is so important. And a lot of border communities are this way as well. For the most part, we are very welcoming of people who come to live, who try to find like home and belonging in this new area. We've got space for them. It's a big, broad, wide open area. The river is very giving. And we want to be giving as well. And so all these people who were fleeing the Dust Bowl were invited in and welcomed and made part of the community. A few decades later, my mom and dad ended up at McAllen High School together, and they fell in love, or whatever ooey gooey thing happened. And it was an interesting time because it was the 60s, and there was a lot of civil unrest, a lot of people fighting for civil rights. By that time in the Valley, Mexican Americans had kind of been pushed south of the tracks. They had to ride on separate buses. For the longest time, they had to attend different schools. And so there had grown to be a lot of animosity in the area. And when my mom started dating my dad, my grandparents on that side told her, if you insist on dating that Mexican boy, we're not going to pay for you to go to college. Because she had dreams of being the first person in that family to go to college. Nobody ever had, just like nobody had gone to college on my dad's side of the family either. And she wanted to be the first one, but because she was so in love with him, she lost that opportunity, because that's just how racist they were. It's kind of sad. Later on, they kind of wish they could take it back. But at that time, in 1968, when they got married, it was tough. A couple years later, out I popped. Born in 1970. And I was born into, this interesting mixture of family. On my mom's side, I only ever had one cousin, but on my dad's side, I had dozens of cousins. And so childhood in that area was just really, really rich. If you live in a small town and you don't have a lot of neighbors other than your family members, then your cousins kind of become your friends. I don't know if any of you have this thing where you grew up with a lot of cousins and they were kind of like your surrogate friends until you got into school. But that's the way it was for me. And a really fascinating thing happened to me that you alluded to, Diane, in your introduction of me. When I was 4 years old in 1974, God, that makes me feel so old. I just turned 54 like on the 27th of February, so it's my age is like on my brain right now. My grandparents are divorced, and my grandmother went to live in South McAllen in a little mobile home, and she took with her chickens. That's what she left her husband and took her chickens. Like, I'm gonna be on my own. And I don't know whose idea it was, but one of the adults in the family, one of my tios or my mom or dad, decided it would be a good idea that summer, since la pobrecita está sola, she's by herself, maybe we should take her grandchildren to visit her on Saturdays so that she'll have some company. But this was like their ostensible reason for doing it. The reality was, it was like free babysitting, right? Just drop off a bunch of kids, like literally 13 boys, ages like 4 to 12. You can imagine she moved to South McAllen to get away from her husband. She just wanted to be with her chickens, not with a bunch of little boys, but there we were, dropped off. And not even, I still remember, they would just like drive up and open the door and they'd be like, blow their horn. Nos vemos, mamá. Te dejo a los nietos. And so, yeah, it was great, And we would run around and we would chase her chickens. And I don't know if you ever chased a chicken. Chickens don't like to be chased because they suspect that you're chasing them for nefarious reasons, right? And usually if you're chasing a chicken, you probably are going to wring its neck and have some caldo de pollo, right? But we would do it. We were like just mischievous, terrible kids. Éramos tremendos. And at the end of about an hour, my grandmother would poke her head outside and we would stop like throwing dirt clods at each other or whatever crazy thing we were doing. And she would like, ya métanse huercos. And we would, if you don't know what the word huerco means, it means like brat. But like, I don't know, I'm going to give you a little etymology lesson because this is just kind of the way my brain works. Huerco actually comes from Ladino, a dialect of Spanish spoken by Sephardic Jews, and it means devil. And so literally when you're calling a little kid a huerco, you're calling him a devil. It's so funny. Like, get inside, you little devils. And guess what she was normally doing during that hour that we were causing havoc outside? Baking for us. Because even though we were little imps, she did adore us. She loved us. And so she would bake cakes or cookies, and she would make agua fresca, and we would come inside, and she would give us a little plate with some snacks and a little paper cup. I still remember those little paper cups of agua fresca. My favorite was agua de melon. And she would sit us down, and she would sit in her rocking chair. And gosh, I mean, now that I'm 54, I realize she wasn't much older than I am now, but she seemed really ancient to me when I was 4 years old. Like, wow, she had lived through it all. She knew everything. And she would tell us stories. And now, we were all boys. As luck would have it, at that time, there was only one girl cousin, Christy, who was like 2 years older than me. And 6-year-old Christy did not want to spend Saturday with 13 boys ages 4 to 12 for reasons that I think are pretty clear, right? And since we were all boys and we all liked scary stories, she gave us exactly what we wanted. Like crazy scary. Like when I think of the fact that I was 4 years old and heard these stories, I don't even know like how I made it to the present with my like sanity intact. Because like a lot of Mexican-American grandmothers, she was telling us stories with the intent of scaring us away from doing certain things, right? So about half a mile from our house on Ridge Road was a canal. It's a very agricultural community, and these canals were connected to pump stations that pumped water from the river up to fields, and that you would open these sluice gates, and the water, whenever it was time to irrigate, you'd open the sluice gates, water would come rushing down the canal and overflow and fill the fields. But when the sluice gates weren't open, and you could never predict when they would be, the water was, about like this high on me, and you could go swimming in it. But unfortunately, a lot of kids over the years have been trapped in those canals when the sluice gates open and have drowned. So she really didn't want us going there, especially since the little ones, we couldn't swim. So she would tell us that, there at that canal, many years ago, during, right after the Revolucion, during the time of La Matanza, when a bunch of Texas Rangers lynched Mexican Americans in South Texas in the year 1915 because they were afraid of an uprising, that a woman had fallen in love with a Texas Ranger and had children by him, two boys, twins, and then he had abandoned her when the troops were recalled, and that she had lost her mind with grief and had drowned the children in the canal. And then realized what she'd done, she drowned herself. You know this story very well, right? La Llorona. And how her spirit wanders the canal and any other body of water nearby, looking for the souls of children, she would tell us. And if you happen to be there, it's not that she's evil and wants to kill you. She's going to think you're one of her children, and she's going to pull you into her embrace and pull you into the water, and you will die. When I was 4 years old, this made a very large impact on me. I was like, wait a minute, she killed her children? And she's like, sí, y tu mamá tampoco es muy estable que digamos, so maybe you shouldn't get your mom upset because I don't know. My grandmother did not like my mom very much. And I didn't want to take a bath after that. I insisted that if she had said any body of water, and obviously a tub full of water is a body of water. So my dad had to teach me how to take a shower because I was not getting in the bathtub. It was really funny. She would tell us other stories too. We were sometimes pretty mischievous and made her upset. And so she would say, ojalá y se componen. I hope you guys, straighten yourselves out because, I wouldn't want what happened to that boy that one time to happen to y'all. What boy? What happened to him? Well, there was once this boy who misbehaved all the time and it irritated his grandmother, and made her cry and so forth. But unbeknownst to him, the grandmother had a neighbor, a comadre, who was secretly a lechuza. You guys know what a lechuza is, right? A witch that transforms into an owl, okay, which is like just really, really kind of a scary thing, right? Una lechuza. And, one day she was having coffee with her comadre and a tear rolled down her wrinkled cheek and her comadre was like, ay, ¿qué le pasa, comadre? Why are you crying? And, oh, well, my little grandson, no matter what I do for him, he's an ungrateful little brat and makes me cry. And don't worry about it, the comadre said. One day I'm sure he'll get his just desserts. What comes around goes around. And that very night she transformed into an owl and smashed through the window of the little boy's bedroom and snatched him up in her talons and flew off into the night. And he was never seen or heard from again. This is literally the way almost every single one of her stories ended. Misbehaving little boy was never seen or heard from again. I wanted to know more. I wanted to know what happened to the boy after that. Like, hello, did grandma call the police? Is there a special squad that hunts down La Llorona and las lechuzas and I was just imagining there's the lechuza has a shack out in the woods where she keeps captive children, little nest instead of furniture in the living room. The police surround the little cabin. Come out with your wings up in the air, lechuza. My grandmother would just look at me as I was spooling this hypothetical out, ay Dios mío, que estás mal en cerebro. There's something wrong with you. And, yeah, what was wrong with me is she was telling me these stories when I was 4 years old, right? But the day came where she told me, ¿sabes qué? Se me acabaron los cuentos. I have no more stories to tell you. And I don't have answers to the questions you have about these stories because the stories just end. They happened once upon a time and they just end. If you want more and if you want answers to your questions, you're going to have to learn to read, güero. And I was like, read? Why? Because in books, you find more stories and there are answers to these questions you have. And my mom had read a couple of books to me, and so I was like, I think that might be true. Yeah, I've enjoyed these books my mom's read to me. And so I told her, okay, well, teach me to read, Grandma. And she said, no, dile a tu mamá. Tell your mom to teach you to read. I've already put up with you the entire summer of Saturdays. This is enough. So I did. I bugged my mom to teach me to read, and she did. So by the time I was 5, I could read, which is really... if I had to pick a single pivotal moment in my entire life, that's it right there. And now, as a professor of education and English and stuff like that, I know some things that I obviously didn't know then, and that is the number one predictor of a kid's likely success in school and in college is the age at which they learn to read and the amount they read thereafter. And so, like we say in Spanish, de pura chiripada, just by happenstance, I learned to read when I was little. And I was supported. My family thought it was great that I would learn to read. And my mom, would take me to the library. The first day of kinder rolled around, 1975, 76. When did I go to kinder? I guess it was 5. And I went to school. I was so excited because there were going to be books. I was going to be able to read. And then the teacher that very first day said, "Okay, class, today we're going to learn the letter A." And she started writing the letter A on the board, and I was like, wait a minute. I know the letter A. And all the other 26 letters, I know how to read. But these other kids don't, because it was less common in the mid-'70s for kids to know how to read when they came to school. And there wasn't like pre-K or anything like that. So I told my mom I didn't want to go back. I dropped out of school, dropped out of kinder, 5-year-old little rebel. And instead, my mom took me to the public library every day, and I read and read and read and read. And so by the time I got to first grade, and like you literally have to go to first grade, right? Put your parents in jail if you don't send your kids to school. There was no homeschooling back then, so like nowadays you could get away with it probably. I was reading at a 3rd grade level, and they tested me in there. So I went into the 3rd grade reading class every day. I would leave the 1st grade. This did not make me a very popular child, because I would come into the 3rd grade class and I'd be like, "Hi everybody, I am David Bowles. I know I can read really good. I read better than y'all." And those 3rd graders like, "What? Who brought this like little munchkin?" Because I'm short now. When I was 6 years old, I looked like I was 3 years old. It was like ridiculous. And people all the time say, "You don't look 54. Yeah, I've had this problem my entire life. I look a lot younger than I actually am. Got carded until I was in my mid-30s. That's the way it is. But there was something kind of cool about it. And I knew I was kind of an outcast, but it was neat that I was able to do something that other people couldn't do. And so by the time I was in 3rd grade, I was reading at a middle school level. By the time I was in high school, in middle school, I was reading at a college level. And it just transformed my mind and gave me opportunities that I don't think I would otherwise have. You see, in my family, like all the men worked in the building trades. So you were either a carpenter or a plasterer or a welder, so you worked in the trades, which is a wonderful thing, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. A lot of my cousins work in the trades and make more money than I do. But it was something that I knew that I didn't want to do. I knew that another path was opening up for me. I was reading, I was getting excited about the things I was learning in school. And when the teacher started talking about college, about their experiences in college and about what college could do for us, I started to get really excited. And so when I was 13, I remember because you got apprenticed to one of your older relatives, right? And I was unlucky enough, I suppose, to get apprenticed to my grandfather, Manuel Garza, who was a plasterer. And that winter break, I had to spend it with him. And it was an unusually cold and rainy winter in South Texas. And I had to roll this wheelbarrow around, and my hands were getting all covered with ampollas, with like blisters. And the hard work everybody was doing, I was just looking around me like, I do not want to do this. I do not like this. I don't want to do it. And so there was one point where the wheelbarrow kind of I bumped a rock and some of it spilt out. And my grandmother said, chamaco, mira donde andas. And I was like, chale, yo no quiero hacer esto. I don't want to do this. I'm going to go to college. And he's like, that's good. I'm happy you're going to college because you're not really good at this. But I also don't want you to be a useless person. I want you to have some skills. So you're going to continue helping me the rest of the Christmas break. But yeah, ultimately my family was supportive. Although none of them knew what to do, like how to help me, how to support me. Like, what do you do to help a kid who decides he wants to go to college when he's 13 and like nobody in the family has? They didn't have any advice for me. They were just like, well, talk to your teachers, talk to the counselors, like, just figure it out, and we'll help you. Like whatever they say to do, we'll do it. It's fine. And then my parents divorced, and it made things like really hard. We ended up living because my dad left us, and his family kind of blamed my mom for their breakup and for his leaving the valley altogether. It was tough. I was cut off from his family, and they had been the center of my life for such a long time. That was really, really, really hard. And we ended up moving to a distant town in the same area, but far away from them, and living in Section 8 housing, the projects basically, and on food stamps. And it was a really, really tough time. But I kept taking refuge in libraries. It's a place that I would run to because there were a lot of gang violence around, a lot of drugs, lots of prostitution. It was a really tough place that I lived. And the library was the place that I could find, solace and escape and like read books. And I wasn't doing particularly well in school, but I was like on the inside growing and growing and growing, and still had those plans, hopefully, to escape. But because I was so brokenhearted, because it's really tough when a parent like leaves you and then you don't hear from them ever again, because it makes you feel like there's something wrong with you, right? I began to kind of act out in school and talk back to teachers and like get sent to the office. And I was never getting sent to the office because I was like in a fight or whatever. I was getting sent to the office for like correcting teachers' grammar. It's like the weirdest thing ever, right? And it was tough to stay away from gangs. The big gang in Far Texas where I lived, because the school district is like of 3 different towns, Far, San Juan, and Alamo, and so they're called the Tri-City Bombers, which is just, I have to give it to them. That's a badass name, Tri-City Bombers. If you're gonna have a gang name, make it something cool like that. You're like, all right. They didn't bomb anything, but it still was like a cool name. I'm wearing like a bomber jacket today. I'm like, that would have been really cool if they had this all worn bomber jackets. They would just look at me like, that's mal, way, that's mal. But when I was in those libraries finding escape, one of the things I began to notice, because I had a couple of friends, Ranulfo Marquez and Gustavo Acosta, who were like nerdy Mexican Americans like me, who didn't fit in and who like lived in the projects or whatever. And one of the things that we started noticing as we would read together, we skipped class all the time. But we wouldn't leave campus, we would go to the library. How nerdy do you have to be, like skip class and go to the library? And then the librarian like knew we were supposed to be in class, but the librarian like kind of shielded us. The librarian knew what was up and knew that we needed this, and like let us it's really hard for me to believe that they did it, but let us have those times, those moments. And we began to notice that in all the books that we loved to read, something was missing. There weren't Mexican Americans in those books. This is now 1987, okay? And we loved reading a lot of things. We read science fiction, fantasy, horror, but we also read, all kinds of like literary fiction and poetry. For a while, we were all really into Black women authors like Alice Walker and Toni Morrison, Octavia Butler, and then suddenly, just one day, my friend Ron Marquez was like, "Dude, are there any books by Mexican Americans in this library?" And we started looking around, and there weren't. It was really a devastating kind of realization. That same year, my 11th grade English teacher, who I was at odds with at the beginning of the year, but by the middle of the year, she had kind of like taken me under her wing and tried to nurture me. She read in Reader's Digest about a book writing contest for teens. Avon Books was offering this contest, and she told me, you're a really, really good writer. Because I didn't do my homework, but whenever I wrote an essay, I would get really good grades. I would get A's. And she goes, you ought to try to enter this contest. It's a writing contest. And I was writing what, like short stories, poetry? She's like, no, writing a novel. I was okay. I think I could probably pull that off. I was really into humoristic science fiction at the time. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was my favorite book. And I decided to write like that kind of a comedy. But then I told her, so what's the deadline? She goes, oh, you only have 6 weeks to do it. So I had to write a novel in 6 weeks. I should have been dissuaded from it at that point. But I was like, no, I can do it, because I just won't do anything else. And so I wasn't doing homework anyway, let's just be honest. I was in the middle of my class, I didn't care or whatever. So I just focused on writing, and in a month I had written a draft of it. My mom rented a typewriter. I know this is gonna seem really weird to y'all. Rented a typewriter. This is 1987. People don't have computers in their homes, not people who live in poverty at least. And most people didn't have typewriters, but she rented a typewriter. I typed it up on carbon paper so that I could send a copy in and have a copy for myself. Because also you couldn't just pop into a Xerox store and easily make copies. And I sent it off, and I would wait by the mailbox every single day. I waited like 3 weeks for them to get it and look at it, and I'm sure I'm going to win. And I would wait by the mailbox every single day, and then finally the letter came, and I was so excited. I did not open it at the moment. I ran up the stairs and burst into our apartment, and I was like, Mom, and my brothers Fernando and Mateo came out, and we all gathered around, and I opened it up, and it was like, Dear David Bowles, we regret to inform you that your book, Jaywalker Time Travel, that's what it was called. It was about a Chicano kid who travels through time. Oh, it was such a bizarre book. He loves peanut butter. It's a weird, I don't know. I think back on it. You might be like, well, haven't you ever reread it? Oh, so here's the trick. Here's the tricky part of it. I had given the other copy to my girlfriend, and then we had broken up. And she had moved away to Denton, which is like on the other side of the state. And you might be like, the other side of the state? Well, yeah, have you seen Texas? The other side of the state is like 5 states away if you're living in any other state. And to this day, I don't know whether, I'm assuming she threw it away or burned it or like, whatever, did some kind of like voodoo spell over it or whatever. But I'm kind of hoping that maybe she kept it, and like suddenly I'll get a phone call or an email, and she'll be like, so how much? How much do you want for this? Because I could just sell it on eBay. You're famous enough that I'll get some money now, so we'll see. I still know people who know her, and I keep meaning to reach out to see, but I also just don't want to be disappointed. I'd rather like live in my fantasy world that she's got it in a shoebox somewhere and then it'll show up. But I didn't win, and I was kind of upset. I'll be honest, started crying. But my mom was like, why are you crying? Do you know any other 17-year-olds who have written a novel? And I'm like, well, no. She goes, there you go. I mean, you did this thing, and you can do it. And it was true. It was like a moment of decisiveness for me. Like, I saw a path forward for myself. And I now understood why I needed to go to college, because I needed to figure out a way to become an author. So I went to college. There, in the neighboring town of Edinburgh, there was at the time it was called Pan American University. And about halfway through my career there, it became the University of Texas Pan American. And it was at that school, in my the second semester of my freshman year, I had gotten such high scores on the ACT that I got to skip over freshman English and a couple other courses. This made the valedictorian of my high school very mad, because I was like the rebel who didn't care and had long hair and played guitar in a band or whatever. And and when she found out that I had gotten a higher score than her, she was really upset and slapped me in the cafeteria. Well, she slapped me not because I'd got a higher score, but because I told her that she was an ass kisser, and that's why her grades were better than mine. And so, of course, she slapped me in front of everybody. So. But I went to college, and it was that second semester I was taking a world literature course, because, like I said, I didn't have to take freshman English. And in that class, in this world literature course, we read a book called The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. It was the first book I had ever read written by another Mexican American. And even though it was written about Chicago and stuff like that, I was like, wow, this is my life. This is like my people, this is my community. And it felt so good and self-affirming. And it's not like I needed it to become a better reader or whatever, but I needed it to feel like that there were other people who were doing what I was trying to do, and that I could be empowered to do it as well. And also that semester, I took an Intro to Anthropology course with Dr. Mark Glazer, who's now in his 90s, but we're like friends. We became friends eventually. Such a great guy. And in that class, I discovered that all these folktales that my grandmother had been telling me when I was a child, and all the other storytellers in my family, were like written up in books and were studied by anthropologists and folklorists, and had their roots in colonial New Spain, Mexico, before it became Mexico, and that those stories had their roots in the indigenous mythology and sacred stories of the people of Mesoamerica before the Spanish invasion. I was kind of upset, I'll be honest with you, that none of this stuff had ever been taught to me when I was in a school in the Rio Grande Valley, living just a few miles from Mexico, where I went all the time as a kid to visit our relatives there, because my great-grandmother, Genoveva Ramirez, lived in Reynosa, and a lot of my dad's cousins did, and so my entire childhood was spent going back and forth. And I had never heard the name Quetzalcoatl or Tezcatlipoca or any of the other gods of the Aztec people or the Maya people or any of the other 62 indigenous peoples in Mesoamerica, many of communities of which are, still exist today. So I was a little upset. No Mexican American literature, none of this mythology of, some of my ancestors. And it made me say, you know what? I feel like I've been robbed. I feel like people have deliberately tried to take something from me or from my community. And I would ask my dad and my grandfather and my uncles and just everybody in my community, do you know these things? And they're like, well, no, or maybe yes, but it was so long ago when I was a kid before the revolution in Mexico. And then I would ask people in Mexico, and they were like, well, yeah, they teach us some of that stuff in school, but not very much. And I realized that we'd spent 500 years having this stuff taken away from us, and it was really kind of outraging. It outraged me. It was outraging. It outraged me. And so I decided, I don't know if you remember that scene in the original Star Wars film, which is now called A New Hope or whatever, where Darth Vader is fighting Obi-Wan Kenobi, who's now all old. And there's, Obi-Wan tells him, if you strike me down in anger, I will become more powerful than you could possibly imagine. Kind of taunting him and like getting Darth Vader to kill him so that he can become a Force ghost. I know way too much about Star Wars, I'm sorry. And I felt that way. I was like, you've tried to eliminate the Mexican part of me, and especially somebody who has a white mother, a non-Mexican American mother. I really felt it like really bitterly. So I'm going to become more Chicano than you possibly imagine. I'm going to double down on this. And so I started studying and going down these rabbit holes, like learning how these threads of indigeneity still existed in my family's heritage and our stories and so forth. And eventually going so far as to learn Nahuatl, an indigenous language of Mexico, so that I could read colonial texts that were, written by Nahuas, by the ethnic groups that the Aztecs had belonged to, because the Aztecs were just like 3 Nahua groups that controlled central Mexico, but there were a lot of other Nahua groups, like another 13 city-states that lived around that area. And it just opened things up for me. Along the way, I became a teacher. I started teaching middle school, 7th grade. Teaching 7th grade is something else, man, I tell you. And I taught 7th grade for 8 years. I feel kind of like I've earned a reward in heaven or something like that. That's you guys remember when you were in 7th grade, right? That's a tough time. Trying to do the same thing, trying to make them see that there were possibilities, that their stories were important. It was really hard for me to find stories in the mid-90s when I started teaching that had Mexican Americans in them, but I did have the House on Mango Street and a couple others, and I brought everything I could in. And then when I ran out of things, I started retelling my grandmother's stories. The stories that she had told me as a kid, I started retelling them in short story form and using them in the classroom to teach all the different elements, of, dialogue and characterization and foreshadowing and things like that. And then I got the kids to do the same thing. I'm like, go home to the cuentistas, to the storytellers in your family, have them tell you these old stories before they're gone. Write them down in your own words, using your own voice and whatever tools you have at your disposal, the things that I've been teaching here in this class, and let's keep them alive. And some of those students from that year, that was my 3rd year teaching middle school, when I made the realization that was the way to move forward. They're still my friends. Many of them are teachers, continuing the same kind of what we call ethnographic work, right? Keeping the stories of our community alive in new media. They've been kept alive orally, but now we write them down. Now we make them into movies. We make them into TV series. We make them into graphic novels and the poems, and we keep those stories alive because they're stories that sustain us and anchor us. Because one of the things that I never wanted to do was to let going to college make me forget where I came from. My family was really concerned about it. I was concerned about it because it seemed like the message was to become an educated, scholarly person, you kind of have to turn your back on your Mexican American heritage. And for a while, I almost took the bait, but it was those moments of realization in those 2 classes I had that made me realize that I didn't have to do that. And there were plenty of professors who were like, don't do that. You can have your cake and eat it too. College should be an additive thing. It should add to your identity, not subtract from who you are. You don't have to stop speaking Spanish. You don't have to start speaking Spanish if you don't speak it, but you also don't have to stop speaking Spanish. You can be who you are and who your family has helped you to become, and then you can add things to that. Identity doesn't have to be one or the other. And it was a very liberating thing, and I tried to do the same thing with my students, and it was useful. And I ended up teaching for 14 years before then going on to become the director of English language arts for the entire school district. And when I did that, when I moved out of the classroom, I looked at all the things that I had written with those students over 14 years, and I was like, oh shit, I've got a book. I had gotten so caught up in teaching and then having a family, because I got married and had kids, whatever. And then I had gone on to get my master's, and I was in the middle of doing my doctorate when I moved out of the classroom into this administrative position, that I hadn't lost sight of my desire to be a writer. Because I was writing with students, but I was just in the field writing as a way to help kids, and I wasn't thinking about, I should get published. I wasn't worrying about that. And then when I stepped away from the classroom, I was like, okay, now's time. I was in my late 30s by then. I had spent, a good 16 years just using my writing as a vehicle for helping kids. And then I pulled the best of those stories together, and they got published as my first book. And I was 41 when my first book came out. I always tell people this because there's a lot of misunderstanding about writing and about publishing, and a lot of people think that you have to break through in your early 20s with a bestseller and just make a lot of money, or else you'll just never be successful. And that's not true at all. There's lots of roads into publishing, and I found a way in through indie presses and university presses. And then by the time I was 45, a book of mine that was called The Smoking Mirror got the Purva Prey from the American Library Association. The Purva Prey is an award that is specifically for the best books written by Latinas for Latina children. And getting one of those awards, it was the silver, not the gold, but still, I'm not going to turn my nose up at a silver award, right? Like you're in the Olympics and you're like, there's the guy with the gold medal, but you got the silver medal right here next to him, so you're still like standing on the box with the winners, right? And it really turned things around, because then suddenly people were like really, really interested in my work and wanted to talk to me. And pretty soon after that, I started getting published by there's 5 major publishers. They're called the Big 5, and now I've been published by 3 out of the 5. And so it's a nice feeling. And I continue to create this work that builds upon my identity and my love of the borderland, my love of the Mexican-American community, and my acknowledgement and my desire to share with people in our community that our roots are deep. That yes, we are partly European, but we are partly indigenous as well. And our roots, and we're also partly African, and we're partly Asian as well. A lot of people don't realize these things, but the Black and Asian community in Mexico is not something we can turn your eye away from. It's very much an important thing, and they've been neglected and forgotten. And racism in Mexico, for those of you who've been in Mexico, is bad too, just like it is everywhere else in the world, right? And just wanting to carry those stories forward. So a lot of my books, like I look back and I see the Sea-Ringed World, which is a book that I translated and then partly expanded, that was originally published in Mexico. And it tells all of these, it retells a bunch of sacred stories from indigenous people from Alaska all the way down to Tierra del Fuego in Argentina, right? And that kind of work, that reminding us of the rich plethora of stories that existed here long before Europeans ever set foot on these shores, and that continue to be retold and shared in the present day was really vital to me. And then right next to it is another book of mine called The Prince and the Coyote, which is my most recent book, which is a novel of historical fiction about Nezahualcóyotl. And I don't know if you know who Nezahualcóyotl is, but he was one of the 3 founders of the Aztec Empire. And when he was a teenager, he was the crown prince of Texcoco, a city-state on the eastern bank of what then was called Moon Lake. Later it would be called Lake Texcoco, but it was called Moon Lake. And this is all like just under Mexico City now, all this that I'm talking about. And his father was killed and their homeland invaded by an empire from the other side of the lake called the Tepanek Empire. And the Tepanek Empire was like ethnically more or less the same, like everybody in that empire had the same ethnicity, whereas Acolhuacan, where Texcoco was an ethnically diverse area. And in the city where Nezahualcóyotl grew up, there were 6 different groups of people living side by side. And this is something that the empire couldn't stand. And so, they invaded and tried to impose their will and their identity on this other country. And he went on the run up into the mountains, just barely surviving. One of the reasons we know so much about him is because he was a poet, and his poetry is some of the only poetry from before the Spanish invasion that still exists, that has survived all the destruction of the Spanish invasion. And so in that book, I was able to take the poems that he actually wrote when he was a teenager on the run, and from the empire, and weave them in and tell the story of how he survived, how he fell in love, and all the things that he went through, and how he eventually made his way to Tenochtitlan, where his uncles lived, because his mother was Mexica, so he was like ethnically diverse. We might say of mixed heritage or something like that. And with them, come up with a plan to overthrow that empire and start their own Triple Alliance. It's an amazing story, so fascinating, so rich. And it's only because of this deep dive into Mesoamerican lore that I was put on, because I went to college and discovered the things that had been kept from me. And I do think that is one way to look at college, is not only a tool for you to get a better job or whatever the heck we think is so important in our capitalist society, but also as a way to expand who you are, to dig deeper into your roots, to learn more, and to use all the tools that they put at your disposition here at the university or at a community college like this one, to find yourself, to find where your roots are. And I think that work never ends, and I continue to do it. I've published 36 books. Some of them are when I say 36, people are like, wow, I always have to kind of admit that about 12 of them are translations of 12 others of them, because I put my books out in English and in Spanish, right? So it's kind of like, well, you're cheating a little bit there. You've got 20 English titles and then 16 translations, some of which are translations of your own work. Okay, whatever, but they are 36 individual titles, nonetheless, right? And I feel really, really blessed to be able to do this kind of work, to represent my community, to inspire other people to do the same thing, because our stories are worth telling. The stories of the Boer, the stories of its people, and the stories of our ancestors, and how we were able to come to where we are today, the struggles that we had to go through to become what we are today. These are important stories, and I want to tell them. So we kind of reached the point where I can answer some questions, because I could go on and on about myself forever, but I'd much rather hear what you want to know. So ask away. Anything at all that you want to ask, and there's no such thing as a dumb question if it's asked with the right attitude. Yes, sir?
What are you working on now?
So right now, I just finished up another children's book. This is going to be my 3rd children's book. It's called Stealing Song from the Sun, and it is a retelling of this Nahua myth about how Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl decide. They find out that the sun has music. His attendants play him music, and they see that humanity doesn't have any instruments. They have no way to make music to make themselves feel better or to sing praises to the gods. So they do this heist. They go off, they sneak into the house of the sun, and they steal instruments and musicians to bring them to Earth so that they can teach humanity music. It's a really, really cool story, and it's fun to tell those kinds of stories in ways that kids are going to like. I've been working together with a friend of mine, Guadalupe Garcia McCall. We had a book come out last year called Secret of the Moon Conch, which is like a romance novel about a Mexican girl in modern times she's fleeing cartel violence in Veracruz. All her family is dead, except for her father, who lives in San Antonio. So she's trying to come to the U.S., and she finds on the beach before she leaves this like really, really old conch that used to be used as a trumpet in ceremonies, and it's all carved with these intricate glyphs. And when she takes it with her, she finds herself connected mind to mind to a Mexica boy during the fall of Tenochtitlan is under siege by Cortez and his Tlaxcalteca allies, and the city's being bombarded by cannon fire and stuff like that. And he's like desperate, and he's like blown. His mother was a priestess of the moon goddess, and he's blown the trumpet, and they've been connected mind to mind. It's just an amazing story, a love story across 5 centuries. It's kind of like, like an Aztec version of The Lake House, that movie with Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, where they share letters through the thing. And then we have another book that's coming out in June called Hearts of Fire and Snow, which takes the myth of the 2 volcanoes in Mexico. I don't know if you guys know, right next to Mexico City, there's 2 volcanoes. The one you probably see in the news all the time, they call it Popo. The full name is Popocatépetl, right? And it's always blowing smoke and volcanic ash and stuff like it put in the sky. And then right next to Popocatépetl is Iztaccíhuatl, which in Nahuatl means white woman. And it looks like a woman laying on her side, like the profile of a woman, like covered with snow. And the legend is, it's like a Romeo and Juliet story where every lowrider in California has an image. You guys have seen this image, right? Of Popocatépetl, of Popoca, when he's a human, holding the dead body of Iztac, his beloved, who's killed herself thinking that he's dead, that he's died in battle. And he carries her up into the mountains, and the gods turn them into mountain gods. And this is like what happens next, because he demands that she be revived. What happens if the gods do? What happens if she gets reincarnated in the modern day in Reno, Nevada, as a Chicana at a high school, and he's got to come down off of his mountain where he's been living for 1,200 years, like regenerating himself every 52 years to find her. And we're working on a 3rd book now that hopefully will come out probably about 2 years from now, which is a vampire book set on the border. And we like to say it's Romeo and Juliet meets From Dusk to Dawn, and it's like indigenous vampires versus European vampires. It's so cool. I love stuff like that. Then I have another graphic novel coming out in the fall with my daughter. My daughter's a really great illustrator, and we have a series called Tales of the Feathered Serpent, and the first volume came out a few years ago, and now the second volume is about to come out. So I've got tons of stuff going on. I'm always writing. I usually have a couple books come out a year. It's really hard to keep up with me. People are like, dude. But it's because I write for little kids, and I also write for what we call middle grade, which is like 4th through like 8th, and then I write for teenagers and I write for adults. So I have books coming out all the time for all those different age groups. And if you're ever interested, you just go to davidbowles.us and you'll find like all the stuff that I'm doing and my books that are out with descriptions and stuff like that. So you can kind of keep track of it, because I lose track of what I'm doing sometimes. Other questions? Yes, first you, and then we've got lots of people. So you can go first, and then we'll pop around over here.
I know you mentioned like the big publishers. Like, have you had any challenges trying to get published? Especially like if you're like saying, oh, like I want to do like stuff on American studies.
Yeah.
Because I like even when you mentioned publishing, I just read a report like from a couple weeks ago where it was about like diversity in big publishing.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
still, I think humor is still like predominantly.
It's predominantly white, yeah. 75% white women, yeah.
Have you experienced a lot of like challenges?
Definitely at the beginning, there were a lot of challenges. Things have gotten better over the past 10 years, although recently, like with book banning and stuff like that, there's like pushback, because the last 10 years has shown like real growth. Publishers have done a lot of work to acquire more and more works by by Latinx people, by people from communities of color in general. So things have gotten better, but in the beginning it was really hard. That's why I started with indie presses and university presses, because because you have to have an agent for the big 5 to pay attention to you. And I couldn't get an agent because nobody wanted to represent my work, because they would tell me, wow, there's too much Spanish, and all the names of these indigenous gods are so hard. They have so many syllables. I'm like, what do you want me to do? Shorten them? Well, could you? No, I'm not going to shorten the name of the indigenous. Are you out of your mind? I'm gonna call down the wrath of my ancestors, because I'm like, oh, we just call Quetzalcoatl. We call him Quetzal, or just Quetz. Call him Quetz. Yo, Quetz, what up? No, you can't do that. He might find it amusing, but I doubt it. But yeah, I mean, it's tough. But like, when I won that award was when the sea change was beginning to happen, and like all these agents, like, I'd been rejected by like 30 agents, and a whole bunch of them after I won the award were all like, oh hey, you know how you were ahora sí, man. Oh. So it is complicated. But the diversity survey you're talking about, that's from Lee and Low, A smaller publisher, they're the ones who are publishing my graphic novel that's coming out. I have several books with them. They're really good, and it's cool that they're keeping track of that. I also co-founded like an activist movement back in 2020 called Dignidad Literaria, and we like literally forced Macmillan, one of the big five, to sit down with us to talk about how they were going to improve representation for Latinos in their publishing. It was in response to the publishing of American Dirt, which was like a huge controversy, and I actually had Oprah Winfrey like talking shit about me on her show when they, in the midst of all that. Was a lot of I took a screenshot of her like saying David Bowles and like the subtitle going David Bowles. And I was like, there, Oprah Winfrey said my name. She was not being nice, but she said my name. You know, these little claims to fame. Like one time I got, my claims to fame have been really weird. I got quoted on Criminal Minds. So at the end of a lot of Criminal Minds episodes, there's like a quote, you know, da 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 da, and then they say the name of the author. And in one of these episodes, it's like, when wounds are healed by love, the scars are beautiful. David Bowles. And like all my friends who were fans of the show were like, wait a minute, what? Like our David Bowles? Like, and like my Facebook feed back then was like flooded, and there's so many emails. It's funny how people are like, oh yeah, you're a writer, and then you get quoted on the Criminal Minds, you're like, oh shit, you're a writer. You're a writer, right? What did you think? It's so funny. You guys had questions. What was your question?
I was just curious if you heard a story in your childhood about Kukui and what it might be. I only heard him as a boogeyman.
Yeah.
I don't have any background about it.
Yeah, sure. No, the Kukui is a fascinating figure. So the Kukui comes from Spain originally, and the name is either El Cucu or El Coco, and this is like this. There's a really famous painting by Goya that has this shapeless figure and like kind of like some kind of like mantle over it with like a just dark space where the face should be. And the idea was like this like shapeless creature of darkness with no features, or sometimes like with a face that literally looks like a coconut, like just like a blank face, and you know, sometimes with weird bumps or whatever. And then it's been like the name exists in all Latin American countries because it was exported during the invasion to all of the Americas. But here on the border, this is where we added the Y. It's so weird because throughout Mexico you hear cucu or coco, but cucuy is a border version of this. Like if you go deeper into Mexico and you say cucuy, they're like, what? And you're like, oh, no, I mean cucu or coco. And they're like, oh, okay. Cucuy is like, and no one is exactly sure where the Y came from. It's like, why do we stick a Y on it? But it's definitely, I think it gives it like, because you have like, in Spanish, if you're trying to say, you know, like ooh, you go ooey, right? And so I think that ooey sound gets assimilated into cuckoo, and you get cuckoo. So it's like an extra ooey at the end. Yeah, which I think is great, because then we say, there's that saying, right? Ooey, cuckooey. So I suspect that that's probably where it came from. But yeah, no, definitely a creature from like medieval Spain, just a boogeyman, just a figure. But in border lore, it becomes more like specific, and there are descriptions given to it. And like, sometimes they say the cuckoo has like one big ear that it can use to hear children from like wherever they are, and then search them out like it's sonar or something like that. Really strange stories. So every region has their version of the cucuy, but it is essentially, I think a lot of people, like my friend Javier Garza, who is also from the Valley but lives in San Antonio now. He's got lots of books for children, and he talks about cucuys in the plural, just so that it kind of comes to mean like monsters in general, like any kind of creepy creature, yeah. And you had a question, sir? No? Okay. Anybody else have a question? Okay.
Are you still teaching now?
Yeah, I still teach. I teach at, I moved from about in 2016. I decided that it would be better to move into higher education exclusively, because I was part-time teaching at the university while I was a public school teacher, and also when I was central office administrator, I would teach a class a semester or something like that. But then in 2017, I started working as tenure track faculty at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley, and I still teach there to this day. And now I'm also the English education coordinator So I'm kind of like in charge of the pre-service teachers and that means I get to influence a lot of teachers. They all have to come through my hands. And so I get to like try to like manipulate their brains and make them think like me about this kind of stuff. Because I want them to have classrooms that are student-centered, that bring in a variety of literature, but definitely some literature that centers the lives of our students in the Rio Grande Valley. And so it's like really rewarding to do that kind of work.
I think it's really important.
I agree with you.
My favorite class that I had at U of A, Leon's was beginning of English words from Latin and Greek, and somebody just told me to take it, so I signed up for it, and it was a room that with people in chairs and everyone but on the floor.
Oh wow, that's how popular it was.
Well, because who tells stories? You know, I still remember the stories of how words became. And,
Yeah.
you know, I haven't seen any class like that. And my students that I have now at Pima, they have no, I mean, they haven't had a teacher like you. That
Yeah.
would be so wonderful to have.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an important thing, and which is why I see the preparation of teachers so important. But, you know, obviously we live in a time where teachers and librarians are like under a lot of stress. You know, here in this state and in Texas and in Florida and in other states that are trying to, you know, frankly, well, I don't even have to enter into politics, just frankly try to micromanage education in a way that takes the professional autonomy away from people who like have degrees and know their shit. I'm sorry that I'm so vulgar, I can't help it. You know, that's what's unfortunate. And, you know, you could set aside the political agenda that's behind it and just, you know, if people have degrees and have certifications, you ought to allow them to do the work that they know how to do. That is, you know, supported by research and stuff like that. And so unfortunately, when you have people scared of the consequences, they tend to not take risks in their teaching. But I always tell people, when you close the door, it's you and those students. And you need to do what's best for those students and not worry about anything else. And you know what's best for the students because you've studied and you know what's best. And you got to set aside your fear of consequences and be brave, be a courageous leader, be a courageous teacher. You know, just think about the people who have lived in much tougher times than we did. Imagine the people who took the huge risk of teaching enslaved people to read when it was illegal to do so, or helping them escape and, you know, get to states where they wouldn't be recaptured and taken back to their masters. You know, think about the people who stood up against, you know, the racial apartheid of, you know, of the 20th century to allow Mexicans and indigenous people and black people and so forth to have access to things that society said they shouldn't have access to. I mean, these were risks that people took. And when you live in tough times, unfortunately, you have to be braver perhaps than you would like to be. But I think it's important that we be brave. And there are, you know, a lot of faculty in here, and it's not always easy to be brave because, you know, you have people you love and you know that your bravery might put them at risk, it might, you know, put your job at risk. But ultimately, can you really live with yourself if you bow your head to the whims of like dictatorial kind of edicts from people who don't know anything about education? So it's kind of like you have to play the game a little bit. You have to like smile and say, yes, sir, and da-da-da, and then you have to go in your classroom and do what's right. Do what you know ethically is best for kids and what research shows is best for kids. So hopefully, you know, students in Tucson and its environs will have one or two teachers in their careers that will do this kind of stuff for them. Because sometimes that's all you need. Just one teacher to believe in you. That's all I needed was just a couple. I slept through the cracks for a lot of classes, and you know, I was in the middle of my class, and it was whatever, and this Chicano kid with a white last name, you know, whatever. But there were people who believed in me, and when adults believe in you as a kid, that's a big thing. And even when you're a young adult, when you're in your early 20s, to have people around you who believe in you and lift you up, that matters. And of course, we don't always act like we're like, we roll our eyes and act like we're all like, oh my God, these annoying adults, but it matters. It does matter. And it has an impact on people, whether they admit it right to your face or not. So, yeah. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for your time. I know that the bookstore is here and they have some of my books. I mean, I hate to like actually, I probably shouldn't even say this. They're hardcover books. They're not going to be as cheap as like paperback books, but they are really they're good books. They're both really, really good books. They're both of oh, this is really interesting, was both of those are illustrated by Amanda Mijangos, who's a Mexican illustrator. They're beautiful books. Really, really worth your time. And even if you don't decide to pick something up today, I really recommend that you pop online. If you like to read ebooks, my books are all available in ebook version. But I have something to share with you, and it might inspire you, and it might inspire somebody else in your family. So thanks a lot. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm going to go sit back there if you have more questions, okay?